He was just a single father, working double shifts at a downtown diner, invisible to the world that rushed past him every day, until one split second of instinct revealed a past so classified, so dangerous, that it would shatter everything the most powerful woman in the city thought she knew about heroes, sacrifice, and the man who just saved her life. Aaron Crestvale appeared to be nothing more than a quiet server balancing plates and raising his young daughter alone. But when bullets flew through the windows of the Meridian Financial Tower, the man who threw Amira Solvin to the ground and neutralized 3 armed attackers with his bare hands wasn't a diner employee. He was a ghost from the Navy's most elite unit, a decorated operator who had vanished from the radar years ago. This isn't just a story about a rescue. This is about the collision of 2 worlds, the price of buried secrets, and the moment when a billionaire discovers that the man she's about to fall for has been hiding in plain sight all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the heart of downtown Phoenix, where glass towers pierce the desert sky like crystalline monuments to ambition, 2 worlds existed in perfect parallel, never meant to intersect. One belonged to Amira Solvin, CEO of Meridian Financial, a woman who commanded boardrooms with the precision of a surgeon and the authority of a general. The other belonged to Aaron Crestvale, a single father who served coffee and scrambled eggs at Sunrise Diner, a 24-hour establishment that catered to night shift workers, insomniacs, and anyone seeking refuge from the relentless pace of city life. Amira's world was measured in quarterly reports, hostile takeovers, and decisions that moved millions of dollars with a single signature. At 32, she had built Meridian Financial from a small investment firm into a powerhouse that managed assets worth over $2 billion. Her days began at 4:30 a.m. with market analysis from 3 continents, continued through back-to-back meetings in climate-controlled conference rooms, and ended long after most of the city had gone to sleep. She lived in a penthouse that offered panoramic views of the Sonoran Desert, drove a Tesla that cost more than most people's annual salary, and wore tailored suits that whispered power before she even spoke. Aaron's world was measured in different units entirely. Tips that determined whether he could afford his daughter's dance lessons, the number of hours he could string together between his day shift at the diner and his weekend job doing maintenance at a local community center, the careful balance between being present for Kayla, his 8-year-old daughter, and earning enough to keep their small apartment in the West Side District. His days began at 5 a.m., preparing for the morning rush at Sunrise Diner, continued through serving customers who rarely looked up from their phones long enough to say thank you, and ended with homework help, bedtime stories, and the quiet satisfaction of another day successfully navigated as a single parent. The distance between their worlds wasn't just economic, it was dimensional. Amira moved through life with the confidence of someone who had never questioned whether she belonged in any room she entered. Aaron moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to make himself invisible, to blend into backgrounds, to observe without being observed. She commanded attention effortlessly. He deflected it instinctively, yet both worlds shared the same geographic space in downtown Phoenix. The Meridian Financial Tower rose 43 stories above the intersection of Central Avenue and Van Buren, its blue-tinted glass reflecting the mountain ranges that surrounded the valley. 6 blocks away, Sunrise Diner occupied the ground floor of a building that had seen better decades, its neon sign flickering intermittently, its vinyl booths patched with duct tape, its coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Amira had never set foot in Sunrise Diner, though she passed it twice daily in her Tesla. Aaron had never been above the lobby of the Meridian Financial Tower, though he could see its lights from the diner's kitchen window during his closing shifts. Their paths crossed only in the abstract sense that all urban lives intersect, sharing traffic lights and breathing the same desert air. But Phoenix had a way of bringing unlikely elements together. The city itself was a testament to the power of convergence. A metropolis that had grown from nothing in a landscape that seemed hostile to human habitation, sustained by the collision of technology, determination, and desert resilience. It was a place where reinvention was not just possible but expected, where people came to disappear and emerge as someone new. Aaron had chosen Phoenix for exactly that reason, though few people knew the full story of why he needed to disappear. To his co-workers at the diner, he was just another single father doing his best in difficult circumstances. To the other parents at Kyla's school, he was the quiet dad who always showed up on time but rarely lingered for small talk. To his daughter, he was simply everything, the center of a world that felt safe and stable despite its modest dimensions. The morning routine at sunrise. Diner never varied. Aaron arrived at 5 a.m. sharp, unlocked the side entrance, and began the familiar choreography of preparation. Coffee brewing, grill heating, prep work for the breakfast rush that would begin when the night shift workers finished. Their long hours and the early commuters needed fuel for their days. He moved through these tasks with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, but those who looked carefully might notice something else in his movements, a controlled efficiency that suggested training that went far beyond food service. By 6 a.m., the diner would fill with its regular cast of characters. There was Elena, a nurse finishing her shift at the nearby hospital, who always ordered 2 eggs over easy with wheat toast and thanked him with tired sincerity. There was Roberto, a security guard from one of the downtown office buildings, who took his coffee black and strong and left exactly a 15% tip every morning. There was Thesa, a night janitor at the courthouse, who usually fell asleep in booth 3 while waiting for the bus and whom Aaron never had the heart to wake unless absolutely necessary. These were his people, the invisible workforce that kept the city functioning while others slept. He understood them because he was one of them, part of the vast network of service workers who moved through the shadows of prosperity, essential but rarely acknowledged. They shared a common language of exhaustion, determination, and the quiet dignity that comes from honest work performed without fanfare. Amira's morning routine was equally predictable but operated in an entirely different sphere. Her alarm sounded at 4:30 a.m. in her penthouse, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that made it seem like a circuit board spread across the desert floor. By 5 a.m., she was reviewing overnight market reports from London and Tokyo while her personal trainer guided her through a workout routine designed to maintain the stamina required for 16-hour days. By 6 a.m., she was in the back of her car, driven by a private service, reviewing briefing documents for the day's meetings while the city awakened around her. The Meridian financial tower had been designed to impress. Its lobby featured art installations that cost more than most people's houses, marble imported from Italy, and a security system that could rival many government facilities. Amira's office occupied the entire top floor, with views that stretched to the mountains in every direction and technology that allowed her to monitor markets around the globe in real time. She was, by any conventional measure, enormously successful. Meridian Financial managed portfolios for celebrities, tech entrepreneurs, old money families, and new money disruptors. Her investment strategies had generated returns that consistently outperformed the market. Financial magazines featured her on their covers. Business schools used her case studies in their curricula. She had achieved everything she had set out to accomplish when she started the company 7 years earlier. Yet success, she had discovered, was a more complex proposition than she had anticipated. The higher she climbed, the more isolated the view became. Relationships became strategic. Conversations became negotiations. Trust became a luxury she could rarely afford. The price of being at the top was often paid in loneliness, though she had become skilled at disguising that cost. Even from herself, neither Amira nor Aaron could have predicted that their parallel worlds were about to collide in a way that would change everything they thought they knew about safety, identity, and the hidden depths that people carry beneath their public faces. Neither could have foreseen that an ordinary Tuesday morning would become the fulcrum on which both their lives would pivot, revealing truths that had been carefully buried and setting in motion events that would force them both to confront who they really were beneath the roles they had chosen to play. The stage was set for convergence, though neither player yet knew they were part of the same story. Tuesday morning arrived in Phoenix with the kind of brilliant sunlight that made the desert city feel like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The sky stretched endless and blue above the valley, unmarked by clouds, offering the illusion that this day would unfold like any other. Amira Salvan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her 43rd floor office, watching the city come alive below her, unaware that this ordinary morning would shatter every assumption she had about safety, power, and control. The first indication that something was wrong came at 9:47 a.m., when her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom with an edge of tension that immediately commanded attention. "Miss Sullivan, we need you in conference room A immediately. There's been a development with the Henderson acquisition." Amira's mind shifted instantly into crisis mode. The Henderson acquisition represented 18 months of careful negotiations, a deal worth $300 million that would establish Meridian Financial as the dominant player in Southwest investment management. Any development significant enough to require an emergency meeting could mean the difference between unprecedented growth and catastrophic setback. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Conference room A occupied the southwest corner of the floor, its glass walls offering panoramic views of the Phoenix Mountains while maintaining the transparency that modern business culture demanded. The room could accommodate 30 people comfortably, though today it hosted only the core team, 12 individuals whose combined decisions would determine the trajectory of hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars in investor capital. As Amira entered the room, she immediately sensed the tension that hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Her chief financial officer, Elias Varick, stood at the head of the polished conference table, his usually calm demeanor replaced by an agitation that set alarm bells ringing in her mind. Market volatility reports covered the wall-mounted screens, red numbers cascading like digital rain. But the expressions on her team's faces suggested this crisis went beyond normal market fluctuations. "Talk to me," Amira said, settling into her chair with the controlled grace that had become her signature. "What are we dealing with?" Elias cleared his throat, a gesture she recognized as his tell when delivering news that no one wanted to hear. "We've discovered irregularities in the Henderson portfolio. Significant irregularities. Someone has been systematically manipulating their asset valuations, and if our preliminary analysis is correct, the entire acquisition may be built on fraudulent numbers." The words landed like physical blows. Amira had built her reputation on due diligence, on the kind of exhaustive research that revealed hidden problems before they became public disasters. The possibility that her team had missed something this fundamental challenged not just the deal, but her credibility as a leader and the foundation of trust that her clients had placed in Meridian Financial. "How significant?" she asked, her voice maintaining its professional calm while her mind raced through the implications. "Potentially company-ending significant," Elias replied. "If Henderson has been overstating their assets by the margins we suspect, and if we proceed with the acquisition based on fraudulent valuations, we could be looking at SAC investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and criminal exposure for everyone involved in the decision-making process." The room fell silent except for the barely audible hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of traffic 43 floors below. Amira looked around the table at faces she had worked with for years, people who had helped build Meridian Financial from an ambitious startup into a major player in the financial services industry. The weight of their collective future pressed down on the room like atmospheric pressure before an earthquake. How do we proceed? She asked, though she already knew the answer would be complex and painful. We need to halt the acquisition. Immediately, said Janice Vaymond, head of legal affairs. We need to conduct a complete forensic audit of Henderson's books. We need to prepare defensive strategies for when this becomes public. And we need to do all of this while maintaining absolute confidentiality until we understand the full scope of the problem. Amira nodded, her mind already shifting into the strategic mode that had served her well in previous crises. Elias, I want you to coordinate with our forensic accounting team. Janice, prepare briefings for our primary investors. We need to control the narrative before someone else defines it for us. Everyone else, maintain normal operations until we know more. Not a word of this leaves this room until we have a complete understanding of what we're dealing with. As the meeting progressed, Amira found herself falling into the familiar rhythm of crisis management. Assigning responsibilities, establishing timelines, identifying potential risks and mitigation strategies. This was the kind of challenge that had always energized her, the high-stakes problem-solving that separated successful leaders from those who crumbled under pressure. But as she spoke, delegating tasks and projecting confidence, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts that she refused to acknowledge. What if this crisis was beyond her control? What if the meticulous systems she had built to protect her company were inadequate against forces she hadn't anticipated? What if the very success that had insulated her from the struggles faced by ordinary people had also isolated her from the intuition and street wisdom that might be necessary to navigate this particular storm? The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, with each minute bringing new complications and deeper implications. Market reports suggested that rumors were already beginning to circulate in financial circles. Regulatory contacts hinted at increased scrutiny from oversight agencies. Competitor intelligence indicated that rival firms were positioning themselves to benefit from any weakness in Meridian's market position. By the time the meeting concluded, Amira felt the familiar weight of leadership settling on her shoulders like armor that protected her while simultaneously constraining her movement. She had faced crises before and emerged stronger, but something about this situation felt different, more personal. As if the challenge went beyond business strategy and touched something deeper about her identity and values. As her team filed out of the conference room, each carrying assignments that would consume their lives for the foreseeable future, Amira remained standing at the window, looking out at the city that had become both her kingdom and her responsibility. 43 floors below, people were going about their ordinary lives, unaware that decisions made in this glass tower could ripple through the economy and affect thousands of jobs, retirement accounts, and families. The weight of that responsibility had never felt heavier than it did in this moment, when the systems she had built to manage risk seemed inadequate against threats she had failed to anticipate. For the first time in years, Amira Salvan felt something she had almost forgotten how to experience: vulnerability, what she could not have known. As she stood in that conference room preparing for the fight of her professional life, was that the real crisis was still 67 minutes away. The Henderson acquisition would prove to be merely the opening move in a sequence of events that would test not just her business acumen, but her fundamental assumptions about safety, trust, and the hidden depths of human capability that exist just beyond the edges of ordinary perception. The calm before the storm was ending, though she didn't yet know that the tempest approaching would arrive not through financial markets or regulatory agencies, but through the violent intersection of her carefully ordered world with forces that operated according to entirely different rules. 6 blocks away from the crisis, unfolding in the Meridian Financial Tower, Aaron Crestvale moved through the familiar choreography of the lunch rush at Sunrise Diner with the same precise efficiency that had characterized every shift for the past 3 years. The restaurant buzzed with the controlled chaos of urban dining, plates clattering, conversations overlapping, the eternal dance between kitchen and dining room that kept the establishment functioning like a well-oiled machine. To the casual observer, Aaron appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be. A competent server navigating the demands of food service with professionalism and grace. He took orders accurately, delivered plates without spilling, refilled coffee cups before they emptied, and maintained the kind of polite, invisible presence that marked experienced service workers. His movements seemed natural, unforced, the product of someone who had found his place in the world and accepted it without complaint. But those rare individuals trained to recognize such things might have noticed subtle anomalies in his behavior. The way his eyes continuously swept the room, cataloging entrances and exits, noting the positioning of other people, maintaining situational awareness that went far beyond the requirements of restaurant work. The way he moved his body with controlled precision, maintaining balance and readiness even while carrying multiple plates or navigating between crowded tables. The way he listened to conversations without appearing to eavesdrop, processing information and assessing potential threats from a dozen different interactions simultaneously. Aaron had learned long ago that the best way to remain invisible was to become indispensable in plain sight. People noticed dramatic gestures and obvious competence, but they overlooked quiet efficiency and humble service. In 3 years at Sunrise Diner, he had perfected the art of being seen without being observed, recognized without being remembered, appreciated without being questioned. The lunch crowd at Sunrise Diner represented a cross-section of downtown Phoenix's working population. Construction workers from nearby job sites ordered substantial meals that would fuel them through afternoon heat. Office workers from smaller firms sought quick, affordable lunches away from the expensive restaurants that catered to executive budgets. Students from the community college grabbed sandwiches between classes. Retirees nursed coffee and conversations that stretched across multiple hours, finding community in a place that welcomed their presence without rushing their departure. Aaron knew them all by sight, if not by name. He understood their routines, their preferences, their unspoken needs. Mrs. Chun, a widow who lived alone, needed the social interaction as much as she needed the food, so he always had time for brief conversations about her garden or her grandchildren. Martinez, a day laborer who worked irregularly, sometimes struggled to afford meals, so Aaron had developed a system of accidentally preparing extra food that needed to be consumed before it spoiled. Thompson, a veteran dealing with PTSD, preferred the corner booth where he could see the entire restaurant. So, Aaron made sure that table remained available during Thompson's usual hours. This network of care and attention had emerged naturally from Aaron's personality, but it also served a practical purpose. By making himself essential to the daily rhythms of the restaurant and its community, he had created a life that was both meaningful and sustainable. More importantly, he had built a cover identity that was genuine rather than manufactured, rooted in real relationships and authentic service rather than elaborate deception. The afternoon had been proceeding normally when Aaron noticed the change in Roberto's behavior. Roberto, the security guard from one of the downtown office buildings, usually maintained the relaxed demeanor of someone whose job involved more observation than action. But today he seemed agitated, checking his phone repeatedly, glancing toward the windows with an expression that suggested concern rather than routine vigilance. "Everything all right, Roberto?" Aaron asked as he refilled the man's coffee cup. Roberto looked up with the expression of someone who had been wrestling with a difficult decision. "Probably nothing," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just some weird activity around the Meridian Financial Building this morning. Guys in suits who didn't seem like they belonged, asking questions about building security, taking pictures from across the street." Aaron's training kicked in automatically, though he was careful not to let his increased alertness show in his expression or body language. Weird how? Professional cameras, not phones. Multiple angles. Coordinated timing. Roberto shook his head. Probably just some consulting firm doing a security assessment, but something felt off about it. too organized for random corporate stuff. The conversation continued for another minute before Roberto returned to his lunch and Aaron moved on to other tables. But the information lodged in his mind like a puzzle piece seeking its proper place. After years of civilian life, he had learned to distinguish between ordinary urban paranoia and legitimate security concerns. Roberto's observation suggested something that warranted attention, though Aaron hoped his instincts were wrong. As the afternoon progressed, Aaron found himself paying closer attention to the street activity visible through the diner's windows. Phoenix's downtown area maintained a steady flow of pedestrian and vehicle traffic, but the patterns were familiar enough that anomalies stood out to someone who knew how to look. Around 2:30 p.m., he noticed a black sedan that had been parked across the street for longer than normal, its occupants remaining in the vehicle despite the heat that made extended idling uncomfortable. By 3 p.m., 3 similar vehicles had appeared in the general vicinity, positioned with what appeared to be strategic coordination. Individual details that might have seemed innocuous in isolation began forming a pattern that triggered recognition in Aaron's trained consciousness. The positioning suggested surveillance or preparation for action. The timing suggested coordination. The professionalism suggested serious intent. Aaron had hoped to leave that part of his life permanently behind when he moved to Phoenix with Kyla 3 years earlier. The skills, the instincts, the constant state of readiness that had once defined his existence were supposed to remain dormant, relics of a past that no longer applied to his current reality. But once developed, such capabilities never truly disappeared. They simply waited beneath the surface, ready to emerge when circumstances demanded their activation. As he moved through the final hour of his shift, Aaron found himself conducting the kind of threat assessment that had once been second nature. Building layouts, sight lines, escape routes, defensive positions, all cataloged automatically while he continued serving coffee and clearing tables. Part of him hoped he was overreacting, that civilian life had made him paranoid about coincidences that had innocent explanations. But another part of him, the part trained to recognize patterns and anticipate danger, understood that something significant was developing in downtown Phoenix this afternoon. The question was whether it would remain someone else's problem or whether circumstances would force him to remember skills he had spent 3 years trying to forget. At 3:45 p.m., as Aaron finished his shift and prepared to collect Kyla from school, he made a decision that would have seemed inexplicable to anyone who knew him only as a diner server. Instead of taking his usual route home, he walked the 6 blocks to the Meridian Financial Tower, ostensibly to run an errand at a nearby store, but actually to conduct a more thorough assessment of whatever situation was developing in that area. What he discovered there would force him to choose between the quiet life he had built and the deeper obligations that never truly leave those who have sworn to protect others, regardless of the personal cost. The Meridian Financial Tower cast its shadow across Central Avenue like a blue-tinted monument to ambition, its 43 stories of glass and steel reflecting the late afternoon sun in patterns that shifted with the movement of clouds across the desert sky. Aaron Crestvale approached the building with the casual gait of someone running routine errands, but his trained awareness cataloged details that painted a picture increasingly difficult to ignore. The surveillance had escalated since Roberto's morning observations. What had been subtle reconnaissance 12 hours earlier had evolved into active preparation for something that looked disturbingly like a coordinated operation. Black vehicles positioned at strategic intervals, personnel in business attire whose movements suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds, communication equipment that exceeded the requirements of typical corporate security. Aaron paused at a newspaper stand across the street from the tower's main entrance, ostensibly browsing headlines, while actually conducting a systematic assessment of the situation developing around him. The positioning of the vehicles followed textbook patterns for containment and control. The personnel movement suggested coordination with precision timing. The overall setup indicated planning that went far beyond spontaneous criminal activity. As he watched, a new element entered the equation that transformed his concern into certainty. A delivery van pulled up to the building's service entrance, but instead of the typical uniform worn by legitimate delivery services, the driver and passenger wore the same generic business attire as the other suspicious individuals. More critically, their body language and coordination suggested the kind of specialized training that Aaron recognized from his own background. The pieces clicked, together with the terrible clarity of a puzzle completing itself. This wasn't random criminal activity or even sophisticated fraud. This was a precision operation targeting either the building itself or specific individuals within it, executed by personnel with military or intelligence backgrounds. The level of coordination suggested significant resources and serious intent. Aaron's mind raced through possibilities while his body remained perfectly still beside the newspaper stand. Corporate espionage targeting financial records. Kidnapping focused on high-value executives. Terrorism designed to destabilize financial markets. Assassination disguised as workplace violence. None of the scenarios his training suggested ended well for innocent people who happened to be in the wrong place, at the wrong time. For 3 years, he had successfully maintained the separation between his civilian identity and his former life. Aaron Crestvale, the diner server, had no connection to the classified operations that had once defined his existence. The skills that had made him valuable to the most elite units in the United States military remained dormant, buried beneath layers of deliberate normalcy and genuine contentment with his new role as father and service worker. But as he stood on Central Avenue, watching the situation develop that could result in significant casualties among innocent people, Aaron faced the choice that eventually confronts everyone who has sworn oaths that transcend personal convenience. He could walk away, collect Kayla from school, and return to their apartment where they could remain safely, distant from whatever violence was about to unfold in the glass tower across the street. Or he could remember who he had been before he became who he was, and accept the responsibility that came with capabilities most people didn't possess. The decision was complicated by the fact that any intervention would necessarily expose the identity he had worked so hard to protect. Kyla's safety and stability depended on their anonymity, on the absence of connections to his former life that could bring unwanted attention or renewed danger. By revealing his capabilities, he would risk not just his own security, but hers as well. Yet as Aaron watched the final preparations unfolding around the Meridian Financial Tower, he knew that he could not live with himself if he allowed preventable harm to occur when he possessed the ability to intervene. The oath he had taken when he first put on the uniform had not included an expiration date. The responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves remained valid, regardless of whether he currently carried official authorization. At 4:17 p.m., the situation crystallized. The delivery van's occupants began unloading equipment that was clearly not legitimate delivery materials. The personnel positioned around the building moved into coordinated positions that suggested imminent action. Radio communications increased in frequency and apparent urgency. Whatever operation was being conducted was entering its final phase. Aaron made his choice, moving with the practiced invisibility that had once made him effective in hostile environments. He approached the tower through the blind spots created by urban architecture and vehicle positioning. His civilian clothing provided perfect camouflage, allowing him to move closer to the operational area without triggering the awareness of personnel focused on their assigned sectors. As he drew nearer to the building, fragments of radio communication reached his ears, confirming his worst suspicions about the nature of the threat developing inside the tower. Code words that suggested coordinated breach and control. Target designations that indicated specific individuals rather than random violence. Timeline references that suggested a narrow window for whatever action was planned. Building's security system had been compromised, whether through technical means or human collaboration. The personnel inside the tower were unaware that their normal Tuesday afternoon was about to become something far more dangerous. In approximately 20 minutes, innocent people were going to find themselves in a situation that would test the fundamental assumptions they held about safety and security in modern urban environments. Aaron checked his watch. 4:23 p.m. He thought briefly of Keela, waiting for him at school, expecting their normal routine of homework help and dinner preparation. He thought of the quiet life they had built together, the stability and peace that had replaced the constant adrenaline and uncertainty of his former existence. He thought of all the reasons why the smart choice was to walk away and let someone else handle whatever was about to happen. Then he thought of Amira Salvan, whom he had never met, but whose photograph had appeared in local business publications, and all the other people currently working in that building who had no idea that their lives were about to change in ways they could not imagine. He thought of the oath he had taken and the training he had received and the responsibility that came with capabilities that could make a difference in situations like this. At 4:24 p.m., Aaron Crestvale began moving toward the Meridian Financial Tower with the purposeful stride of someone who had made an irreversible decision. Behind him, he left the safety of anonymity and the protection of ordinary life. Ahead of him lay the confrontation with violence that would reveal exactly who he was, beneath the careful construction of who he had chosen to become. The transformation from civilian to operator occurred gradually at first, then all at once, as muscle memory and trained instincts reasserted themselves after 3 years of dormancy. By the time he reached the building's entrance, the man approaching was no longer just a diner server concerned about public safety. He was a weapon system in human form, activated by necessity and guided by principles that had never truly been abandoned. The collision between his two worlds was about to begin, and there would be no returning to the simple clarity of life before the choice was made. The transformation had begun 5 years earlier, not in the heat of combat or the adrenaline of special operations, but in the sterile corridor of a naval hospital in San Diego, where Lieutenant Commander Aaron Crestvale sat beside a bed containing the most important person in his world. Keela had been 3 years old then, small and fragile against the white hospital sheets, recovering from the emergency surgery that had saved her life but claimed her. Mother S. Sarah had been driving home from Kyla's daycare when the drunk driver ran the red light at 50 miles per hour. The impact had been instantaneous and devastating, but in those final seconds before emergency responders arrived, Sarah had managed to unbuckle Kyla from her car seat and shield her daughter's body with her own. The action had saved Kyla's life and cost Sarah everything. Aaron had been deployed in the Horn of Africa when the call came, conducting operations so classified that his location and mission could not be disclosed even to accommodate a family emergency. By the time Special Operations Command arranged for his emergency extraction and transport home, Sarah had been buried for 6 days, and Kyla was asking questions that no 3-year-old should have to ask. Where's Mommy? When is Mommy coming home? Why won't Mommy wake up? Sitting in that hospital room, holding his daughter's hand while she recovered from injuries that would heal, but trauma that might last forever, Aaron had faced the most difficult decision of his adult life. He was at the peak of his military career, a key operator in a unit whose missions contributed directly to national security. His skills were rare, his experience invaluable, his service record exemplary. The Navy had invested millions of dollars in his training and development, and his teammates depended on his capabilities in situations where failure meant death. But Kyla needed a father more than his country needed another special operator. The decision had not been easy. Military service had defined Aaron's identity since he was 18 years old. The structure, the mission, the brotherhood of arms, the clear distinction between good and evil that characterized special operations work, all of it had provided meaning and purpose that civilian life seemed unlikely to replicate. He understood himself in terms of his military role, measured his worth by his contribution to operations that protected people who would never know his name or understand the nature of the threats he had helped neutralize. More complexly, leaving active duty meant abandoning teammates who had become closer than family, men who had shared dangers that created bonds impossible to explain to civilians. The guilt of walking away from that brotherhood, of choosing personal responsibilities over collective mission, weighed heavily on his conscience even as he recognized the necessity of the choice. The official process of leaving special operations had required 18 months of debriefings, psychological evaluations, security clearance reviews, and administrative procedures designed to ensure that classified knowledge and specialized capabilities would not be compromised by the transition to civilian status. During that period, Aaron had functioned in a strange liminal state, no longer fully part of the military world, but not yet integrated into civilian society. The hardest part had been explaining to Kyla, in terms a 4-year-old could understand, why they were moving away from everything familiar to start over in a place where nobody knew their history. Phoenix had been chosen for practical reasons, remote enough from military installations to minimize the likelihood of chance encounters with former colleagues, large enough to provide anonymity, affordable enough to accommodate life on a service worker's salary. The first year had been brutal. Aaron had possessed highly specialized skills that had little application in civilian employment, extensive experience that he could not discuss or use as professional references, and a security clearance that prevented him from pursuing government work that might have utilized his background. The transition from commanding elite operations to serving coffee and eggs had required psychological adjustments that no amount of military training had prepared him to handle. Worse than the professional adjustment had been the social isolation. Civilian concerns seemed trivial compared to the life and death responsibilities he had carried for over a decade. Civilian complaints about workplace stress or relationship problems felt insignificant when measured against memories of firefights and hostage rescues and counter-terrorism operations. The gap between his experience and that of his new colleagues was so vast that meaningful connection seemed impossible. For months, Aaron had struggled with depression, anger, and a sense of purposelessness that threatened to consume him. He had given up everything that defined him as a person in order to be present for Kyla, but presence alone did not automatically translate into effective parenting. He was haunted by doubts about whether he had made the right choice, whether Kayla would have been better served by his continued military service, and her placement with relatives who possessed normal family skills. The turning point had come during Kyla's first parent-teacher conference at her new school in Phoenix. Her teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, had gently explained that Kyla was exhibiting signs of anxiety and attachment issues that were common among students who had experienced significant trauma and disruption. She needed stability, consistency, and emotional availability from her primary caregiver, characteristics that required patience and time rather than tactical proficiency and physical courage. "She doesn't need a superhero," Ms. Rodriguez had said with the kind wisdom that characterized experienced elementary school teachers. "She needs a dad who shows up every day and makes her feel safe enough to be a little girl." The comment had reframed Aaron's understanding of his new mission in terms that his military background could accept. Protecting Kyla's childhood was an operation that required different capabilities than those he had developed in special operations, but it was no less important than any mission he had previously undertaken. Success would be measured differently, but the stakes were equally high and the responsibilities equally sacred. From that day forward, Aaron had approached civilian life and single parenthood with the same systematic dedication he had once applied to military operations. He studied child development with the same intensity he had once devoted to weapon systems. He learned the routines and rhythms of elementary school social dynamics with the same attention to detail he had once applied to target analysis. He developed patience and emotional availability as deliberately as he had once cultivated marksmanship and tactical planning. The work at Sunrise Diner had emerged from necessity but evolved into something approaching satisfaction. The service industry provided structure and social interaction without requiring emotional investment that he was not yet prepared to make. The tips supplemented his modest savings account, allowing him to afford Kyla's activities and occasional luxuries. Most importantly, the schedule was compatible with school hours and parenting responsibilities. Over 3 years, Aaron had successfully created a life that was both sustainable and meaningful, built around the simple but profound purpose of raising Kyla to be healthy, happy, and secure. The skills and experiences from his former life had receded into background, occasionally useful for practical problems, but no longer central to his identity or daily concerns. But as he approached the Meridian Financial Tower on that Tuesday afternoon, with evidence of a coordinated threat developing around him and innocent people unaware of the danger they faced, Aaron understood that the past he had worked so hard to leave behind was about to reassert itself with a force that would change everything he had built in Phoenix. The choice to intervene would necessarily expose the capabilities he had kept hidden and invite scrutiny that could threaten the quiet life he had created for himself and Kyla. But the alternative, allowing preventable harm to occur when he possessed the ability to stop it, was incompatible with the principles that had originally motivated his service and continued to define his character even in civilian clothes. Standing at the intersection of his two worlds, Aaron took a deep breath and began the process of becoming, once again, the man he had been trained to be in situations where other people's lives depended on his willingness to act decisively in the face of deadly threats. The first shots shattered the glass facade of the Meridian Financial Tower at exactly 4:31 p.m., sending crystalline fragments cascading onto Central Avenue like deadly rain. The sound echoed off surrounding buildings with the distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds, followed immediately by the screams of pedestrians diving for cover and the harsh squeal of tires as vehicles swerved to avoid the debris field. Amira Salvin had been standing at the conference room window, reviewing final preparations for tomorrow's emergency board meeting, when the world exploded around her. The bullet that should have ended her life instead buried itself in the reinforced concrete pillar 18 inches to her left, close enough that she felt the displaced air against her cheek. The second shot followed immediately, this one aimed with precision that suggested the shooter had compensated for wind and distance. She hit the floor hard, driven down by instincts she didn't know she possessed, as chaos erupted throughout the 43rd floor. Emergency alarms began wailing with urgent electronic voices. Security personnel shouted instructions over radio systems that crackled with overlapping communications. Outside, the coordinated attack that Aaron had recognized was unfolding with military precision and devastating effectiveness, but Amira had no context for understanding what was happening or why. From her position pressed against the marble floor, breathing in the dust and debris that filled the air, she could see only fragments of a nightmare that made no rational sense. Armed figures moving through the building's lower floors. Elevator systems shut down by electronic override. Stairwell access blocked by personnel whose movements suggested extensive tactical training. The Henderson acquisition crisis that had consumed her morning now seemed insignificant compared to the immediate threat of survival in a situation that exceeded every security protocol her company had established. This wasn't corporate espionage or financial manipulation. This was organized violence directed at her personally, executed by professionals who had studied her routines and vulnerabilities with enough precision to predict exactly where she would be standing when they initiated their assault. As Amira lay on the conference room floor, listening to gunfire echoing through the building's corridors and emergency responders establishing perimeters 43 stories below, she experienced something that no amount of business training had prepared her to handle. Complete powerlessness in the face of forces beyond her control or comprehension. For 20 minutes, she remained trapped in the conference room with 3 members of her staff, waiting for either rescue or capture while the sounds of combat moved through the building like a deadly storm. The financial empire she had built seemed suddenly fragile and meaningless when measured against the immediate reality of survival. All her carefully constructed defenses, legal and technological and economic, provided no protection against men with weapons who had decided she represented a threat that required elimination. Then the door opened, and everything changed. The man who entered the conference room moved with fluid precision that immediately distinguished him from the security personnel who had been providing updates throughout the crisis. He was dressed in civilian clothes, dark jeans and a work shirt, but his body language suggested training that went far beyond ordinary law enforcement or corporate security. More importantly, he moved through the debris and chaos with the kind of controlled calm that indicated extensive experience in similar situations. "Ma'am, we need to move now," he said, his voice carrying authority that cut through the fear and confusion that had paralyzed the room. "The stairwells are compromised, but I know another way out." Amira looked up from her position on the floor, meeting eyes that held depths she couldn't immediately interpret. There was something familiar about his face, though she was certain they had never met. More puzzling was the sense that he somehow belonged in this situation, that violence and danger were elements he understood from the inside rather than abstract threats he was struggling to comprehend. "Who are you?" she asked, though even as she spoke, part of her mind was noting the calm competence with which he assessed the room and its occupants. "Someone who's going to get you out of here," he replied, already moving toward the window to evaluate their tactical situation. "But we have approximately 4 minutes before they reach this floor, so explanations will have to wait." What followed was unlike anything Amira had experienced in her carefully ordered life. The man who had appeared from nowhere guided them through the buildings, infrastructure with intimate knowledge of systems, and layouts that should have been available only to architectural specialists or security professionals. He navigated through maintenance corridors and utility spaces that most people never knew existed, moving with the confidence of someone who had studied the building's blueprint with tactical precision. More remarkably, he demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond ordinary civilian training. When they encountered hostile personnel in the stairwell between the 37th and 36th floors, he neutralized the threat with movements so swift and efficient that Amira barely registered what had happened before they were continuing their descent. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just the application of skills that had obviously been refined through extensive experience in similar situations. "You're not security," Amira said during a brief pause in their escape, studying his face in the emergency lighting of the maintenance corridor. "No," he agreed, checking his watch and calculating timing with the kind of precision that suggested military background. "I'm not. Then what are you?" He met her eyes with an expression that contained years of experience she couldn't read, but somehow trusted completely. "Right now, I'm the person standing between you and people who want to hurt you. Everything else can wait until we're somewhere safe." The journey to ground level took 18 minutes, during which Amira observed capabilities that fundamentally challenged her assumptions about ordinary people and extraordinary circumstances. This man moved through violent chaos with the kind of professional competence that suggested extensive training in exactly these situations. He anticipated threats before they materialized, navigated building systems with architectural precision, and demonstrated tactical awareness that went far beyond anything she had ever witnessed in civilian contexts. More importantly, he exhibited a protective instinct that seemed both personal and professional, as if her safety had become his primary mission, regardless of any official authorization or compensation. When debris blocked their planned route, he immediately developed alternative strategies. When hostile personnel appeared in areas they needed to traverse, he created diversions that allowed safe passage. When she struggled with fear and exhaustion, he provided encouragement that was both practical and genuinely supportive. By the time they reached the building's service exit, where emergency responders had established a secure perimeter, Amira understood that she had just experienced something far more significant than a random rescue by a Good Samaritan. This man possessed skills and training that represented years of specialized development, capabilities that were normally associated with military special operations or elite law enforcement units. "The paramedics need to check you out," he said as they emerged into the Arizona sunlight, where ambulances and police vehicles filled Central Avenue with flashing lights and urgent activity. "What about you?" she asked, suddenly reluctant to lose contact with the person who had literally saved her life. He smiled, the first time she had seen anything other than focused intensity in his expression. "I need to collect my daughter from school. She's probably wondering where I am." The statement landed with unexpected force, reframing everything she thought she understood about the situation. This wasn't a professional security operative responding to an emergency. This was an ordinary father who had somehow possessed the extraordinary capabilities necessary to navigate deadly violence and extract her from a situation that should have been beyond civilian intervention. "Wait," she called as he began walking away. "I don't even know your name." He paused, looking back with an expression that suggested internal debate about information he was reluctant to share. "Aaron Crestvale." "Aaron, I need to understand what just happened." "I need to understand who you are." He studied her face for a long moment, perhaps recognizing something in her expression that suggested this conversation was far from over. "I work at Sunrise Diner, 6 blocks from here. Day shift, Monday through Friday." Then he disappeared into the crowd of emergency responders and curious onlookers, leaving Amira standing beside an ambulance with questions that would fundamentally alter her understanding of the world around her and the hidden depths that people carried beneath their public identities. As paramedics checked her vitals and police investigators began their interviews, Amira found herself thinking not about the attack she had survived, but about the man who had saved her life, with capabilities that suggested a story far more complex than anything she could have imagined about someone who served coffee and eggs at a neighborhood diner. The emergency board meeting convened at 8 a.m. the following morning in Meridian Financial's temporary headquarters, a conference room at the Phoenix Marriott that had been secured and swept for electronic surveillance after yesterday's attack rendered their building temporarily inaccessible. 12 faces around the polished table represented billions of dollars in managed assets and decades of collective experience in navigating corporate crises, but none of them had dealt with anything approaching the violence that had shattered their carefully ordered world 24 hours earlier. Amira sat at the head of the table, her tailored business suit concealing the bruises and scrapes she had sustained during her escape from the tower, her composed expression masking the fundamental questions that had kept her awake throughout the night. The Henderson acquisition seemed like ancient history compared to the immediate concerns of corporate security, employee safety, and the investigation that would inevitably follow yesterday's coordinated attack. But as the meeting progressed through preliminary discussions of building security and temporary operations, it became clear that the board's primary concern was not the violence itself, but its potential impact on Meridian Financial's reputation and market position. The conversation that emerged reflected priorities that felt increasingly disconnected from the reality of what Amira had experienced in those terrifying minutes when her life hung in the balance. "The media coverage has been remarkably favorable," reported Jasmine Orville, head of public relations, consulting notes that reduced yesterday's trauma to bullet points and talking points. "We're being portrayed as victims of targeted financial terrorism rather than subjects of legitimate security concerns. The narrative positions us as defenders of economic stability against extremist threats." "Stock price opened up 3% this morning," added Elias Varick, reviewing market data with the detached professionalism that had characterized his entire career. Investors are interpreting the attack as validation of our market importance rather than evidence of institutional vulnerability. Amira listened to the discussion with growing discomfort as her colleagues transformed the most frightening experience of her life into strategic opportunities and public relations advantages. The man who had risked his own safety to guide her through deadly chaos was reduced to a footnote in their analysis, described simply as an unidentified Good Samaritan who assisted in evacuation procedures. "We need to discuss the security protocols going forward," said Maeve Linthorne, the board's longest-serving member and strongest advocate for traditional corporate governance. "Yesterday's events demonstrate that our current systems are inadequate for the threat environment we apparently face." "I agree completely," Amira replied. "Which is why I want to discuss bringing on additional security consultation from someone with demonstrated expertise in exactly these situations." She had spent the sleepless hours after yesterday's attack researching everything she could discover about Aaron Crestvale. Public records revealed basic biographical information: previous address in San Diego, honorable discharge from military service, employment history that included only his current position at Sunrise Diner, but the gaps in available information suggested classified background that raised as many questions as it answered. More importantly, she had replayed every moment of their escape from the tower, analyzing the capabilities he had demonstrated with the same systematic attention she applied to investment analysis. The navigation through building systems, the tactical awareness, the combat skills, the protective instincts, all of it pointed to training and experience that went far beyond ordinary military service. "What kind of consultation are you proposing?" asked Thesa Orvand, head of human resources, with the cautious tone that suggested bureaucratic resistance to unconventional solutions. "I want to hire the person who saved my life yesterday," Amira said simply. "Someone who clearly understands the threat environment and possesses the capabilities necessary to navigate it successfully." The room fell silent as board members processed the implications of her proposal. Maeve Linthorne was the first to respond, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to defining acceptable boundaries for corporate decision-making. "Amira, we understand that yesterday was traumatic, and it's natural to feel gratitude towards someone who helped you in a crisis situation. But hiring decisions, especially for positions involving security and access to sensitive information, cannot be based on emotional responses to extraordinary circumstances." "This isn't an emotional response," Amira replied, though she recognized that defending the proposal would require more than personal conviction. "This is a practical assessment based on demonstrated capabilities under actual threat conditions." "What do we know about this individual's background?" asked Elias, reviewing notes that contained the same limited biographical information Amira had discovered. "Military service, but no details about specialization or security clearance. Current employment as food service worker. No formal credentials in corporate security or risk management. He neutralized multiple armed attackers and extracted me from a 43-story building under active assault," Amira said, her voice gaining strength as she recalled the precision and competence she had witnessed. "I think those credentials speak for themselves. Maeve leaned forward with the expression of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome guidance to a subordinate who had lost perspective. "Amira, you built this company by making decisions based on analysis rather than impulse. Yesterday's experience was clearly traumatic, but we cannot allow trauma to override the systematic evaluation processes that have served you well for 7 years." "What systematic evaluation processes identified the security vulnerabilities that allowed yesterday's attack to succeed?" Amira asked, her patience beginning to fray under the weight of condescension disguised as corporate wisdom. "That's exactly why we need to engage established security consulting firms with proven track records and Appropriate insurance coverage, said Thesa. Not individual contractors with unverifiable backgrounds and unclear motivations. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with board members raising increasingly bureaucratic objections to her proposal while demonstrating complete misunderstanding of what she had actually experienced during the attack. They spoke about liability concerns and background checks and corporate protocols as if yesterday's violence had been a theoretical exercise rather than a life-threatening crisis that revealed the inadequacy of their existing assumptions. I'm not proposing to hire him as a permanent employee, Amira said, making one final attempt to bridge the gap between her experience and their concerns. I'm suggesting we retain him as a security consultant for the investigation period while we develop long-term protocols based on actual threat assessment rather than corporate security. Theater? Absolutely not, Maeva declared with finality that suggested the matter was settled. Meridian Financial cannot afford to be associated with unvetted contractors whose backgrounds raise more questions than they answer. We have a fiduciary responsibility to our investors and a professional obligation to maintain institutional credibility. Amira looked around the table at faces that represented everything she had worked to build during her career in financial services. These were accomplished people whose judgment she had respected and whose support had been essential to her company's success. But their response to yesterday's crisis revealed limitations in their understanding that felt suddenly insurmountable. Let me be absolutely clear, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had characterized her most important business decisions. The individual you're describing as an unvetted contractor saved my life through capabilities that our entire security apparatus failed to provide. Your concerns about credentials and protocols would be more persuasive if our credentialed security professionals had demonstrated similar effectiveness under actual threat conditions. That's not the point, Elias replied. The point is institutional responsibility and risk management, based on established procedures rather than personal relationships formed under extraordinary circumstances. Amira realized that the fundamental disconnect was not about procedures or credentials or risk management. It was about the worldview that treated yesterday's violence as an abstract problem to be managed through bureaucratic processes, rather than a concrete reality that required capabilities most corporations never developed because they never faced situations that tested their actual effectiveness. Then we have a philosophical difference that cannot be resolved through committee discussion, she said, standing with the kind of controlled movement that signaled the end of negotiation. I'll be conducting my own security consultation outside of official company channels. Statement hung in the air like a challenge that nobody quite knew how to address. Maeva's expression suggested disapproval that bordered on accusation of insubordination, while other board members exchanged glances that indicated concern about Amira's judgment and decision-making capacity. Amira, Maeva said carefully, I hope you understand that personal security decisions that could affect company operations or reputation fall within the board's oversight responsibilities. We cannot simply ignore actions that might create liability or public relations complications. Amira met her gaze with the steady confidence that had carried her through every major challenge of her business career. Then I suggest you pay close attention to the results of effective security rather than the comfort of bureaucratic procedures. She left the conference room with the clear understanding that her relationship with the board had fundamentally changed, not because of yesterday's attack, but because of their response to her survival and the capabilities that had made survival possible. The man who had saved her life had inadvertently revealed the limitations of the institutional thinking that had shaped her professional identity for 7 years now. She faced the choice between the safety of conventional corporate wisdom and the uncertainty of trusting her own judgment about extraordinary people who operated according to principles that transcended organizational charts and credential requirements. The afternoon rain that swept across Phoenix arrived without warning, transforming the desert city's usual brilliant sunshine into something softer and more mysterious. Water streamed down the windows of Sunrise Diner as Amira Salvan sat in booth 7, nursing a cup of coffee that had grown cold while she waited for the courage to begin a conversation that would change everything she thought she understood about safety, trust, and the hidden depths that people carried beneath their public faces. Aaron Crestdale moved through his shift with the same quiet efficiency she had observed during their brief encounter outside the Meridian Financial Tower. But now she watched him with different eyes. The way he anticipated customers' needs without being asked. The way he navigated the cramped space behind the counter with fluid precision. The way his awareness extended to every corner of the restaurant, even while focusing on immediate tasks. All of it spoke to training and instincts that went far beyond food service. For 3 hours, she had been working up the nerve to approach him directly, but every time he came near her table, the magnitude of what she needed to say seemed too large for casual conversation. How do you ask someone to explain capabilities that saved your life, but revealed secrets they had clearly worked hard to protect? How do you offer compensation for services that transcended normal professional relationships? At 3:45 p.m., as the afternoon crowd began to thin and Erin finished cleaning the coffee station for the 3rd time, she finally made her decision. She approached the counter with the same controlled determination that had carried her through hostile boardrooms and difficult negotiations, though this felt more personal and more uncertain than any business discussion she had ever initiated. "Excuse me," she said, waiting until he looked up from his work. "I was hoping we could talk." Erin studied her face for a moment, recognizing something in her expression that suggested this conversation was inevitable. "About yesterday?" "About a lot of things," she replied. "But yes, yesterday would be a good place to start." He glanced around the restaurant, calculating timing and customer needs with the kind of situational awareness that never seemed to shut off. "I have a 15-minute break in about 10 minutes. Would that work?" That would be perfect. When he joined her in booth 7 10 minutes later, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee, Amira found herself looking into eyes that held depths she couldn't read, but somehow trusted completely. The man sitting across from her moved with the controlled calm of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, but his expression suggested kindness and genuine concern that went beyond professional obligation. "I need to understand. What happened yesterday?" she began, choosing her words carefully. "Not just the attack, but how you knew to be there. How you knew what to do, how you possessed capabilities that allowed you to navigate a situation that should have been beyond civilian intervention." Aaron sipped his coffee slowly, clearly weighing how much information he was prepared to share. "What did your security analysis tell you about the attack?" "Coordinated assault by professionally trained personnel, with specific intelligence about building layout and security protocols. Targeted operation rather than random violence. Planning that required extensive surveillance and preparation." He nodded. "That matches what I observed during reconnaissance." "Reconnaissance?" "I noticed surveillance activity around your building starting Tuesday morning. The pattern suggested preparation for coordinated action, so I conducted counter-surveillance to assess the threat level." Amira felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, though the complete picture remained unclear. "You were watching them watch us. I was trying to determine whether the threat was real and whether intervention would be necessary. And you decided it was." Aaron met her eyes with an odd expression that suggested this conversation was approaching territory he had hoped to avoid. "I decided that innocent people were going to be hurt by professionals who had the capabilities and intent to cause significant casualties. The alternative to intervention was allowing preventable harm to occur, so you intervened, using capabilities that suggest military training far beyond ordinary service." A long pause, during which Amira could see him making calculations about information he was reluctant to share. I served in specialized units that required extensive training in counter-terrorism and hostage rescue operations. How specialized? Operations. How specialized? Another pause, longer this time. Specialized enough that most of my service record remains classified. The admission hung between them like a door opening onto a room neither of them was certain they wanted to enter. Amira understood that she was being offered access to information that Aaron had worked hard to keep private, and that her response would determine whether that door remained open or closed permanently. "Why did you leave that life?" she asked, though she suspected the answer involved personal tragedy that would be painful to discuss. "My wife was killed in a car accident while I was deployed. My daughter needed a father more than the military needed another operator." The simple statement carried weight that spoke to sacrifices she could barely comprehend. Amira thought about her own life, built around professional achievement and personal ambition, measured against the choice to abandon a military career in order to be present for a grieving young person who had lost her mother. "How old is your daughter?" 8. "Her name is Kyla. And you've been raising her alone for how long?" 5 years. "We moved to Phoenix 3 years ago to start over." Amira felt something shift in her understanding of the man sitting across from her. This wasn't just someone with extraordinary capabilities who had happened to be in the right place at the right time. This was a father who had made profound sacrifices to prioritize his relationship with his daughter, who had chosen ordinary life over exceptional career, who had built a new identity around service and parenthood, rather than the recognition and advancement that his military skills might have provided. "My board doesn't want me to hire you as a security consultant," she said, changing direction toward the practical concerns that had brought her to the diner. "They're concerned about liability and credentials and corporate protocols." Aaron smiled, the first time she had seen genuine amusement in his expression. "I wouldn't pass a standard background check for corporate security work. Too much classified information that can't be verified through normal channels. But you passed the only test that actually matters. You kept me alive when people with perfect credentials and extensive training failed to anticipate or respond effectively to a real threat. Maybe, but I also exposed my background in a way that could complicate my life and Kayla's safety. The anonymity we've maintained for 3 years is probably compromised now." Amira felt a stab of guilt as she realized that her gratitude and desire for security might create problems for the person who had saved her life. "I'm sorry. I didn't think about the consequences for you. It's not your fault. I made the choice to intervene knowing it would probably reveal information I'd rather keep private. So what happens now?" Aaron looked out the window at the rain that continued to fall across the desert city, creating temporary rivers in streets designed for sunshine rather than storms. "I don't know. I've spent 3 years building a life that was simple and sustainable. Yesterday changed that, probably permanently. What if I could offer you something that honored both your capabilities and your priorities as a father?" He turned back to her with an expression that suggested cautious interest rather than commitment. "What did you have in mind?" "Private security consultation that allows you to maintain your current life while providing expertise when it's needed. Work that pays well enough to improve Kyla's opportunities without requiring you to abandon the stability you've built. Partnership rather than employment." "Partnership? I've spent 7 years learning how to build a successful business, but yesterday taught me that success means nothing if you can't protect the people who depend on you. You've spent years learning how to protect people in situations that most of us never face. Maybe we both have something the other needs." Aaron considered the proposal while Amira waited, understanding that his decision would affect not just their professional relationship, but her fundamental approach to security and risk management. The man sitting across from her represented capabilities that corporations couldn't purchase and training that institutions couldn't replicate. More importantly, he represented principles that prioritized protection of others over personal Advancement. I have conditions, he said finally. Name them. Kyla's safety and stability remain my first priority. Any work arrangement has to accommodate school schedules and parenting responsibilities. No long-term deployments or extended travel. Full disclosure about threat assessments so I can make informed decisions about risk levels. Agreed. And I want to meet with your board to explain exactly what they're dealing with in terms of ongoing security threats. Yesterday's attack wasn't random violence. It was professional reconnaissance followed by coordinated assault. That suggests resources and planning that go beyond typical corporate security concerns. Amira felt a surge of satisfaction as she realized that his conditions actually addressed her primary concerns better than any conventional security arrangement could. When can you start? I already started. The moment I decided to intervene yesterday, I became invested in keeping you safe. Everything else is just formalization of a relationship that already exists. They shook hands across the table while rain continued to fall outside the windows of Sunrise Diner, washing the desert clean and preparing the ground for whatever grew next in the complicated partnership between a billionaire who had discovered the limits of conventional power and a single father who had learned that some obligations transcended personal convenience. Neither of them could predict what challenges lay ahead, but both understood that they had crossed a threshold that would reshape their understanding of trust, capability, and the hidden strengths that people carried beneath the surfaces they showed to the world. 3 months later, the rhythm of their partnership had settled into something that felt both natural and revolutionary. Amira's new offices occupied the 15th floor of a downtown building chosen specifically for its security features and proximity to Kyla's school, allowing Aaron to balance his consulting responsibilities with the school pickup routine that remained sacred in his daily schedule. Space itself reflected their unusual collaboration. Amira's executive suite maintained the professional elegance expected of a major financial firm, but now included a secondary office where Aaron conducted security assessments and threat analysis with equipment that most corporations never knew existed. The corner of that office held a small desk where Kyla did homework on afternoons when her after-school program ended early, surrounded by financial reports and tactical planning, documents in a combination that would have seemed impossible 4 months earlier. Stuttgart account is asking about expanding into Eastern European markets, Amira said during their weekly planning meeting, reviewing investment proposals with the same systematic attention she had always applied to business decisions, though now her analysis included security considerations that had never factored into previous strategic planning. Political instability in 3 of the target countries, Aaron replied. Consulting reports that combine traditional market analysis with intelligence. Assessments unavailable through normal corporate channels. Currency manipulation by state actors. Organized crime with government connections. I'd recommend limiting exposure until the geopolitical situation stabilizes. This had become their standard procedure. Business decisions, informed by security realities that most financial firms never considered. Aaron's background provided access to information networks that gave Meridian financial advantages in risk assessment that competitors couldn't match, while Amira's business acumen translated those insights into profitable strategies that honored both opportunity and caution. The transformation had extended beyond professional collaboration. Amira found herself spending Friday evenings at Kyla's soccer games, cheering from the sidelines alongside other parents who knew her simply as Mr. Aaron's friend who helps with his work. The role felt surprisingly comfortable, offering a glimpse into normal family life that her previous existence had never included. Did you see my goal? Kyla asked after one particularly exciting match, her face glowing with 8-year-old pride and grass stains on her uniform. I saw everything, Amira replied, surprising herself with how much she had genuinely enjoyed watching the young girl navigate the controlled chaos of youth soccer. That move around the defender was incredible. Aaron smiled, watching the interaction with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully integrated the different aspects of his life, rather than keeping them in separate compartments. She's been practicing that move for weeks. Wanted to surprise us. The word us carried weight that none of them addressed directly, but all of them felt. Somewhere in the process of building their professional partnership, they had also created something that resembled a family, though nobody had planned it and everyone was still figuring out exactly what it meant. Their unconventional arrangement had also solved problems that traditional corporate security could never have addressed. When a second attempt at corporate espionage targeted Meridian Financial's client database, Aaron's counter-surveillance detected the threat weeks before it would have been discovered through normal channels. When a disgruntled former employee made threats that suggested serious intent, Aaron's assessment and intervention prevented escalation without involving law enforcement or creating public relations complications. More importantly, the partnership had given both of them something they hadn't realized they were missing. Amira had discovered the satisfaction of work that contributed to something larger than quarterly profits, while Aaron had found a way to use his capabilities in service of protection without sacrificing his commitment to Kyla's stability and security. "You know what's funny?" Amira said one evening as they reviewed security protocols, while Kyla built an elaborate blanket fort in the corner of the office. 6 months ago, I thought success meant controlling every variable. Now, I think it means working with people whose capabilities complement your own limitations. Aaron looked up from the threat assessment he was preparing, watching Kyla engineer architectural solutions to the structural challenges of blanket construction. "I used to think protection meant handling everything myself. Turns out it's better when you have partners you can trust with the things that matter most." Neither of them said it directly, but both understood that they had built something rare and valuable, a relationship based on mutual respect, complementary strengths, and shared commitment to values that transcended professional obligation or personal convenience. 1 year after their first conversation at Sunrise Diner, Amira stood in the audience at Kyla's school play, watching a 9-year-old girl perform with the confidence of someone who had grown up knowing she was both protected and valued. Beside her, Aaron applauded with the quiet pride of a father who had successfully balanced extraordinary capabilities with ordinary parenting, creating space for his daughter to flourish without the shadows of his past defining her future. The auditorium was filled with parents, grandparents, and siblings celebrating the achievements of young people who represented infinite potential wrapped in small packages. But as Amira looked around at the faces surrounding her, she realized that everyone in that room carried hidden depths that went far beyond their public roles. The man in the suit might be a former teacher who had switched careers to support his family. The woman with the carefully styled hair might volunteer at homeless shelters every weekend. The couple in the front row might be foster parents, providing stability for teenagers who had never experienced consistent care. People, she had learned, were rarely just one thing. The billionaire CEO had also become someone who never missed a soccer game. The former Navy SEAL had also become someone who helped with math homework and built blanket forts with architectural precision. The quiet partnership they had created had taught both of them that identity was not fixed, that circumstances could reveal capabilities they never knew they possessed, and that the most meaningful relationships often developed between people who saw potential that others overlooked. "She did amazing," Amira whispered as the curtain fell and Kyla took her bow with theatrical flair that would have impressed professional performers. "She's got good role models," Aaron replied, and the simple statement carried acknowledgement of how their unconventional family had given all of them permission to become more than they had been. Individually. As they gathered Kyla's costume and prepared to leave the auditorium, Amira reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had defined success in terms of quarterly profits and market dominance. Today, success meant being present for a school play, understanding that protection was something you provided rather than something you purchased, and recognizing that the most valuable partnerships were built on trust rather than contracts. The story of the single father with extraordinary capabilities and the CEO who learned to see beyond credentials had become something larger than either of them had anticipated. It had become proof that ordinary moments could reveal extraordinary people, that crisis could create opportunity for authentic connection, and that the willingness to trust someone who had demonstrated competence under pressure could transform not just professional relationships but entire approaches to living. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen not when we're looking for them, but when we're brave enough to recognize them, when they appear unexpectedly in coffee shops, office buildings, and school auditoriums where real life unfolds one genuine moment at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.